So great to see so many people here, so many familiar faces, and some not so familiar, but I hope they'll become more and more familiar. I am Linda Harvey, the executive director of the museum. We've had a really exciting time here at the museum over the past few years on a renaissance on our own, building and finding new programs and opportunities for the community to come in and be part of this museum. And it's a continuous growth. And we are so proud and happy to have all of this happening. And I want to also just thank my staff for all that they do in order to put this preparation together. So I would like to introduce our two speakers today. Peter Kennett, he's a registered professional engineer working with control systems, communication, and power. After building a position in the private sector, Peter moved to the U.S. Department of Transportation, where he spent 25 years working on projects like the Panama Canal navigation system, which sounds very exciting. Peter was a chief engineer for the ASR-11, the GPN-30 airport surveillance radar, and the award-winning ground-based detect and avoid system, a system supporting military drone operations. Nearly all of these that Peter has worked on are systems that involve technical foundations from earlier work on remote control communications that was created by, guess who? John Hays Hammond Jr. Peter began his involvement at work here at the castle in 1975. In 1979, he joined the board of directors, subsequently holding the positions of treasurer, president, and now our vice president. After discharge from the Navy service, Peter worked for an organ builder to design a unique combination memory action system for a new console supporting the merger of two organs in a church and limb. So he's lots of experience here with the organ business. Subsequently, Peter worked with Kim Bolton in 1984 and 85 on the design and application equipment for Solid State Ltd. to configure a combination of memory action system for a new EM Skinner console. The console that we are updating today with the Opus 2 ICS system. So we welcome Peter as our first speaker. And then I also would like to introduce John Roper. Gentleman is sitting to his right. John is the owner of the Plenum Organ Company, where he serves as an organ technician, consultant, historian, and musician. Based in New England, he has worked on a range of instruments from the biggest pipe organ in the world. Anyone want to guess? Atlantic City. That's absolutely right. Atlantic City, Broadwalk Hall, to some of the smallest organs. And John has a focus in historically neglected and forgotten instruments, and his company helps organizations to locate resources and funding to find and to bring an organ back to life, which is very, very exciting, and that's one of the things that is happening here. In addition to his work at Plenum Organ Company, John is a member of several professional organizations, including the American Institute of Organ Builders, the Organ Historical Society, the American Guild of Organists, and the American Choral Directors Association. He has been employed by the American Historical Society, Spencer Organ Company, and Oloft Organ Company. And he continues to collaborate on various projects with other builders and organizers all throughout our region. Beyond pipe organs, John has completed engineering with enterprise and networking, lighting and control systems. He is currently a student and former organ scholar at Assumption College, and now is completing a degree in theology to complete his already completed degrees in computer science and music. This Bella is pretty fantastic. Without ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Peter, and we'll get this started. Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, we're talking about fantastic. I just like to recognize Linda because she's a large part of this renaissance which has been going on, and we thank you. We're going to start here with a slide that's probably unfamiliar to most of you. There's what was at one time a very obscure part of mathematics called chaos theory, and it's no longer that obscure. And it tends to try to model things that are very difficult to model, but it's very useful in some cases. And here, you have the saddle point. You'll notice I have right there, looks like a saddle. And that saddle point is the location that could trigger things in this type of study. Right now, we've got a scorpion there underneath a Montiform saddle, and we have a very skittish stallion over here. And we all know what happens with that kind of thing. It's beginning to sound like an episode of Yellowstone or something. But, the sudden departure from the saddle is what is happening here in this example. Again, most of us saw that maybe who are engineering or science backgrounds had it in college, but we're living it now for the last 5 weeks. And we have not had chaos here in Hammond Castle, and particularly not at Hammond Research, Inc. The wooden part of the building that you came in through, where the gift shop is and so forth, was at one time Hammond Research, Inc. 3 floors worth with a shop downstairs. All kinds of fantastic things came out of there. And his small team of people who stayed with him for a long time really did some extraordinary design and inventions and patents. A central part of that was remote control. And remote control in 1913 took the form of the Navy saying, how do we get the limited capabilities we had in radio as we know it to remotely run an unmanned vessel? And this is a time when there wasn't even voice communications to ships at sea. It was all Morse code. And yet these guys figured out how to use spark gap transmitters to be able to control a vessel from here, from Gloucester Harbor to Boston and back, with great success. It brought a lot more work to those guys, but that initial jump into the theory of how radio works and what can be done with it laid the foundation for a lot of really, really important things that have become today to be known as navigation and positioning. We have an internationally known expert in that here with us tonight, Karen Van Dyke. It's used widely in the air traffic control system. Ken Kepchar was one of the master planners and program managers for the last big upgrade to that. All of those things that Hammond started here came to grow into technology that we have each of us in our cell phone. A tiny little 18-watt transmitter, a satellite 25,000 miles above the Earth, can be picked out of the mud by our cell phones. And that all originated, the early theory that came from here. So we're going to welcome you to this island of non-chaos for a while. And we'll let John take you to a focus, which is tonight, Bury the Store. He will reassure you that the next presentation on May 1st at 6 p.m., is that right? We'll be looking at the evolution of the organ and all, but tonight it's more of a historical look. John's done a lot of research. We also have to thank the curatorial staff here who have found a lot of things to help John with that. I might add, they just discovered, you don't know this yet, they just discovered a 1-inch thick folder correspondence on all the parts of the ward in 1941.
I'll hand that over to John, and you're in his good hands.
Set myself up here so that I can stand and talk, and give a little background on things. First of all, I want to thank you everyone for being here. And as Peter said, definitely thanks to the curatorial staff at the museum, because I can tell you part of the reason why this talk even exists today and the reason why so many people are interested in it is that this information just purely has not been available before. And the little information that was available in the past, even through the days when John Hammond was alive, a lot of it was incorrect, and there just wasn't a lot of it. So a lot of what we've been doing alongside the organ work and the curatorial work is to bring it all together and make all this information available and ready for learning from. So thank you again to the curatorial staff. So we're going to start with the story of the pipe organ at Hammond Castle Museum. So I'm going to start here. There's a picture of Joseph Bonnet and John Hays Hammond Jr. Here at the castle in 1941. So in July of 1941, the noted organist Joseph Bonnet recorded an album of music for the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. The recording was done in the newly completed, that they thought, organ at the castle residence here of John Hays Hammond Jr. This recording session was at the request of Hammond himself because he was one of the directors of the RCA at the time. Now, the man in charge of the recording session was Charles O'Connell, and he was the head of the artist and repertoire department of RCA and a talented organist in his own right, having studied with Charles Marie Widor in Paris. So if anyone knows organ history, big French organist. He wrote a 1947 memoir that all about his work in the recording industry and with classical music, but he had a section there about his time here with Bonnet at the castle. And of the pipe organ, he wrote that it was an extraordinary, interesting, but quite badly organized instrument. And this is him reflecting on 1941. Now, it's kind of a hard thing to understand is, this was an instrument that had many famous names involved in its creation. Names like Ernest M. Skinner, G. Donald Harrison, noted organist T. Tertius Noble of St. Thomas Church, New York City, and the Aeolian Company, which were specialists in the mechanical control of pipe organs. So why is he saying this, right? Now, today, this is a picture of one of the rooms of the organ upstairs. The instrument certainly seems like it fits that badly organized label. And as it's not currently playable, it's kind of hard to justify its extraordinary sound if we can't hear it, right? However, I think if we're continuing on with those adjectives that O'Connell gives us, I think the history is the interesting bit. It's the interesting bit that shows that there's a lot more to things than one might expect. So that being said, in order to understand that history, I think we first need to take a little bit of a step back to learn where John Hays Hammond Jr. Was coming from, and then also his obsession with the pipe organ. So this is a picture of that same day in July 1941 with them with the microphones. So we'll come back here. So John Hays Hammond Jr., I'm going to do a little bit of biographical background. I know a lot of you know a lot already, but I just, it's good to be on the same footing. So John Hays Hammond Jr. was born on April 13th, 1888 in San Francisco, California. His father, John Hays Hammond Sr., was a mining engineer, diplomat, and philanthropist who made his money after being put in charge of Cecil Rhodes mines in South Africa. Very lucrative. Hammond Sr. eventually moved back to the U.S. permanently in about 1900 and added to his mining work diplomatic and political efforts, at least in some part inspired by his friendship with President William Howard Taft. I believe they knew each other from school. So this political work only added to the connections that Hammond Sr. had made as a mining engineer, and that he would become so involved in that political work to be considered as a vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 1908, one that he didn't obviously end up really rising to, but he did go on to be called as a special ambassador to England and Russia for the U.S. So this is him with Mr. and Mrs. Charles Lindbergh. So this is important because the societal and financial position of the Hammond family certainly put John Jr., otherwise known as Jack, in a unique position to explore really any interest that he had. Early contact with famous scientists, inventors like Thomas Edison, whom Jack met through his father, and Alexander Graham Bell, who Jack met while in school at Yale, seemed to have put him on a path towards creativity and invention. This is a picture of Alexander Graham Bell and Jack Hammond at some point together. So I think it's important to point out that Jack Hammond was obsessive in everything he did. There's always kind of a mystery behind it, but there is truth to it, right? This can be seen in his later business and social interactions, but I want to use as an example 2 letters written by Hammond Sr., the father, to Jack in 1908. Now, it's a little hard to see, so I might just explain them to you. But the first is in January and the second is in December, almost exactly a year apart. And this would have been during Jack's junior year at Yale. And in the first letter, Hammond Sr. writes to Junior and says, I think, here, I put it up here. Okay. In the first letter, he writes to Junior and he says, you need to focus on your college studies. Stop with all your side projects and everything. I think this is a fairly normal concern for a parent. I admit that this might have been a conversation I've had with my own parents at one point or another. So I feel it. I feel where Hammond Sr. is coming from. However, it's kind of interesting because this is in January and 12 months later in December, Jack's father once again writes to Hammond and with a completely different message. He says, Jack, stop worrying about your schoolwork. Grades don't really matter. Because what has happened is that Jack took his suggestion from January and turned his obsession towards school and was doing nothing else with his life and getting sick and overworking himself and all that kind of thing. So I think this obsessive nature and kind of the scattered way in which he's, going about his life, would become a common and influential theme in the way that he did things. So in 1910, Hammond's college years come to an end, and Jack first gets a job at the United States Patent Office. Now, this is at the advice of Thomas Edison, the happy king, because he told Jack that working in the patent office, he would come across all the new ideas in technology. Really a very smart thing to tell a budding inventor. This Hammond did, and I'm sure it proved educational. However, he did not stay there for terribly long, and he would eventually move back to his parents' estate in Gloucester and build a home and a laboratory for himself there on that land. So that is the Bungalow. Now we're looking at 1919 to 1929. The years of the building and such are a little different than that. I'm focusing on the years that Hammond was concerned with the organ. So this would have been his active years on the organ. So this Bungalow, and it was his first personal residence. It was located on the grounds of his father's estate, less than 2 miles away from here. I could probably walk there if we were fast enough. And Hammond Sr. and his wife had their own large building, mansion, something on the property. And this was Jack's home for him to do with what he wanted. And it's there that he started, experimenting with his pipe organ and his inventions and his workshop and all that kind of thing, in his own space. So located next to the Bungalow, you can kind of see in this top left picture, you've got this building here, but then you can see the bungalow over in the corner, and then you can see another larger building over here. So this was the workshop building. This was part of the laboratory, and this is where Jack and his staff, though mostly his staff, it seems, implemented the ideas that Hammond came up with. Now, the important thing that I have learned in going through the archives and the documents is, as much as Hammond was doing, he was doing so much that he couldn't implement everything himself, or even for the most part. So he had his staff, there were tons and tons of really great letters where different members of the staff were the receiving end throughout Hammond's life, but he would write to whichever staff member it was and say, here, I just had this idea, and then that staff member would have to write it down and draw a diagram and whatever. And this would happen daily or even multiple times a day. And in some cases, there are examples of for example, someone who I'll bring up later, Trainer, there's a diary entry from the day before Christmas, off for Christmas, back on the day after Christmas. So he kept them busy. So of Hammond's staff, it's good that I bring up Trainer, because the two most important staff members to our history of the organ at this point in the bungalow are Albert Trainer and Charles Willett. So Trainer was an engineer who worked at the estate and oversaw the day-to-day operations of Hammond's projects and kind of acted as that drafts person, like I said, taking in the ideas and writing them down. And Charles Willett is an organ man. So he was from Quincy, Massachusetts, which is quite fitting for me because I am also from Quincy, Massachusetts. And he had originally worked for the Johnson Organ Company and then left there to work for Ernest M. Skinner, who's a kind of noted organ builder of the time. And he worked for Skinner for 15 years. And then when Hammond started getting interest in the pipe organ and he realized that he needed someone to work on the organ, I'm not quite sure how the arrangement was worked out, but essentially Charles Willett went to work for Hammond and did so until his death. And he was in charge of constructing the instrument in the bungalow and future planning and some work here in the castle and so on. So, in 1919, Hammond drew up the plans for the organ he wanted to see built for the bungalow. It was an experimental instrument split into a number of sections, each meant to serve a different part of an orchestra. Hammond was very concerned with this idea of orchestral sound, and I'll get to that later. There was a division of strings here, there was a division of woodwinds, there was a division of reeds. Nothing standard here. This is purely Hammond at his house writing things. For the organists in the room, you can tell it makes no sense. However, in addition to that, he had some very interesting things that he threw in there. A little less standard, but still seen, is a piano connected and a glockenspiel. But then he even had a thing called a choral cello, which was an early 1920s invention that was an early precursor to electric organs, like electric tone generation. And it was an interesting thing that had metal bars that were struck and then microphones or sensors kind of like on a guitar that picked up the sound and amplified it. And they were, unlike an electronic organ of even 20 years later than that, where today it wasn't a standalone unit. They were marketed as an instrument that you would actually install. So they were marketed towards the same people that would be buying house organs from real pipe organ builders. So they lived in a large section of the house. So he had one. In fact, he had one or two, and he split them up and wired them in so that he could play them from different places on the organ. Speaking of which, this kind of shows off Hammond's two main interests, right? Which were experimenting with organ tone and layout, and then also mechanical musical control of pipe organs. And these have a bit of overlap. But we can break the first category down into a number of interests, each focused on finding new and interesting sounds that the organ could make or ways that one could play the organ. So, for example, we've got separate families of tone imitating the layout of the orchestra. That's what we saw in the design that he had built. He had a very, very strong interest in the control of the volume and the tone of musical instruments as a whole, to be honest. Throughout his life, from his very early years all the way up to his death, one of the most consistent invention category of ideas that he's always coming up with are different ways to regulate the sound of musical instruments. So he has ideas and patents for the pipe organ. He has ideas and patents for the piano. He developed a piano that had shutters on the top so that you could make it quieter and louder, other than just the way that you would normally play it. Actually, the piano that he built is still here in this room. The shutter mechanism was removed before his death, but the piano is still here. And then he had some kind of, I had some examples of some oddball ideas that, again, were things where he called up his, in this case, trainer and said, here would be a cool idea. So he had an idea for pipes that could change their pitch for a glissando effect. He had an idea for valves that close slowly, which allowed, he called it a piano effect for the pipe organ. Actually, physically speaking, it wouldn't have controlled the loudness. It would have controlled the pitch of the pipes. And then he was also interested in new technologies for tone generation. Like I said, the choral cello. He had a lot of work with speakers, and he tried things with the piano as well, all that kind of thing. So on the other choral cell. So here's an example. Actually, you should be able to read this. This is one of those, this is a diary entry from Albert Trainer. And it's Mr. Hammond disclosed a new system for producing a piano effect with an organ. And he's got sketches and descriptions of a similar apparatus that he needs to reference. And he started his sketches and made blueprints and all kinds of fun stuff. So, you know, he's just being the good worker ant that he is. Hammond's other interest was the mechanical musical control of pipe organs. And this was twofold. This was seen a lot was pipe organs that could play themselves via organ rolls. Now, for the non-organists in the room, this technology is something that had been around since before Hammond's time. Companies, like I already mentioned, the Aeolian Company was one of the most famous, but think of any of the player pianos you might have come across. Essentially, with some minor differences because they're different instruments, the mechanism and the technology that's used in player piano is essentially the same that's used to play an organ, at least as far as the rolls and that kind of side of things works. Hammond didn't care. He said, no, I want to do my own thing. And even more so, he said he wasn't even necessarily interested in making things better for the whole world, which he did want to share his invention, but he was very specifically interested in his instrument and his home. So he did a lot of work with that. And then he also, this is going to sound like I'm saying the same thing, but he was interested in finding new controls and input devices for the organ. So on a pipe organ, there are very standard, you have your keys, you have your pedals, you have your kind of swell shoes, which the organist opens and closes to change the volume of a certain set of pipes, things like that. Hammond was interested, like I mentioned, the glissando effect earlier. He was coming up with new controls to add to the side of the organ that could do other things in addition. So it was a lot of the same thing. This is a picture of Hammond working on one of the only wind chests that he seems to have, one of the only parts of the mechanism of the organ that he seems to have actually constructed in his own laboratory. And it's a very simple, just a couple of sets of pipes and a wooden frame, but it's here. We still have it. So now this, I mentioned that he didn't construct things in his own laboratory, or that he wasn't necessarily sure how to go about that, right? So that's where Ernest M. Skinner comes in. Now, Skinner is an organ builder from the Boston area, and he's most famous for creating instruments emphasizing orchestral sound. Like I said, starting to sound, Boston orchestral seems like a great match, right? So just a little background on Skinner. He worked for George Ryder and George Hutchings before founding his own company in 1902. And he had built around 200 organs across the country, a lot of them for very sizable and important churches in the U.S. By the time that he met Hammond in 1919. So this was a good pairing. We have two diary entries from Hays, from Jack, where he talks about, this is 1922. So this is now a couple years after he would have met Skinner for the first time, and after Willett would have come to work for him. But basically, this is an example of the fact that Mr. Skinner visited me Friday and spent the night at my home, and we went over all the plans. He seemed to think favorable of general scheme and so on and so forth. Skinner is here acting as a helper, right? Ideas, he's helping with the ideas. But then at the end, it also says, he told me he would build any equipment that I desired, but this would be separate from his company. This is important because there aren't really that many records in the Skinner files, the Ernest M. Skinner files, of work done for Hammond, and this kind of explains that. Also the fact that there were fires and things that have destroyed some of the Skinner records over the years. But then you can see that not only is he here, this is Friday, November 4th, he's also back February 2nd. There's all this kind of stuff. He's gotten involved. So where was the organ actually coming from then, right? Some parts were coming from Skinner, but there's a lot that goes into a pipe organ. Pipe organs have pipes that actually make the sound. They have the console, which is where the organist plays the music, and then all of the different mechanisms and ways of carrying the wind to the pipes, all that kind of stuff. So that was coming from Charles Willett. Now, these are pictures of that building next to the bungalow that I showed you. Charles Willett was actually working out of his location in Quincy. All the letters that we have back and forth between them, it seems like just a normal street address. So I would tend to say he was working out of his garage. But, without, proper evidence for that, I'll just say, wherever he was working in Quincy. And what would happen is he had one assistant, and they would get the pipes needed for the organ from a variety of sources, including Ernest Skinner and then a couple of pipe supply houses. Throughout history, there have always been companies in the organ industry that just build pipes, because pipes are very hard to build. And maybe even so less hard, but time consuming, and there's a lot that goes into them. So it's very common for smaller groups, smaller companies to get their pipe work elsewhere. So that's what Hammond was doing. But Charles Willett was building the mechanism. So the pipes are the area up here that make the noise, and then the mechanism are these kind of boxy looking things underneath them that they sit on, and then each mechanism has like a valve underneath each pipe, and they open and close to make the pipes play. So what would happen is Charles Willett would build everything in his house and ship it up to Gloucester, and it would go into this workshop for kind of final assembly and testing before it went into the bungalow. So that's kind of our timeline that we're working with here at the bungalow. Was that they're meeting Skinner in the early, right before 1920, and then they're constructing that organ with the new pipes from Skinner and Samuel Pierce, and the chest and mechanism, and then the additional parts purchased new or taken as needed. The interesting thing that I didn't note on here is that before he starts working with Skinner and with Willett to build his mechanism, he first reached out to a organ builder named William Laws, Sr., who was an organ builder who had formerly worked for the Austin Company, and the Austin Company will come up later. And William Laws had gone out on his own and was actually doing fairly good work at that time in the 20s. However, I think Hammond decided that he wasn't quite sure what he wanted yet, because he had reached out to Laws. There's a letter from him to Laws where he says, actually, I don't want those pipes that you gave me from such and such a church. He was just kind of passing things around, seeing what happened. The other interesting thing that he did right around this time was he reached out to a company in Germany. And I don't know if anyone here knows the Methuen Memorial Music Hall and the Walker organ there. So he reached out to Walker and said, how much would it be for a 150 rank organ for the Bungalow? And Walker's response was to say, where do you live again? And he said, in Gloucester. And they said, oh, we thought you meant Gloucester, England, which is at least a little bit easier to travel to from Germany. So the Bungalow is a building much smaller than this. And this organ has 133 ranks of pipes, and it's still quite a squeeze. So imagine, I don't think that would have ever worked out. But that's that. So what that all resulted in was this. So we have some organ facades here, and we have this kind of interesting custom organ console that Hammond built. And there's some interesting things that I want to point out. The first thing is this roll player up here, which is the method of having the organ play by itself. The music, like a player piano, goes on a paper roll. And when it's fed into the organ, all the complicated mechanics just kind of know what notes to play and things. Hammond was very interested in making that system better so that it could be more versatile and play more things or do more varied things. It's a whole talk to get into the way that mechanical instruments work. So I'll just leave it at that. But if you're interested, there's lots of sources of research in there. Now, the thing I want to draw your attention to is take a look at these and take a little turn. They are, in fact, the same. So I have two additional photos. Here you can see that there were the organ facades on both sides of this room. And then on the other end of the room, kind of up here, there was yet another organ facade right here. Now, what it appears that we are still not sure if these organ facades came from another church or if they were designed specifically for Hammond. The one thing that I do know is that they were designed for someplace close to the sea, because if I were to fly us all up to the top of the facades right now, you would see that the carving at the top is all interesting sea animals that have musical instruments. So either it was designed specifically for Hammond, he's always lived by the sea, or it came from a seaside church or a town, most probably. So that's that. And then we go back to the Bungalow organ timeline. Now I've added something to the bottom of this, because what good is an organ without a player? And well, Hammond would say, I have my own player, it's mechanical, and it does it all for me, and but he would also say, no, he likes making friends, and he likes organists. So December of 1924 is the first place that we have recorded of Marcel Dupré, who's a famous French organist, coming to visit Hammond. Now, Dupré was a traveling organist. He had a church job in France, but he's particularly well known in America for having done multiple tours of the U.S. and concertizing all over the place. But he had enough time to come and say hi to Jack and play. And in Jack's own words, he expressed his keen interest in the instrument which I built, stating that it was the most dramatic and orchestral instrument he had ever heard. We can take this with a grain of salt from the It wasn't Dupre who wrote that. But I think that we would be wrong not to ascribe him some credit, at least from a point of intrigue. So that's the bungalow. Now we got to go to the castle, because Hammond wants more. He always wants more. He wants more ideas, more organ, more room to put his organ in, all that kind of stuff. So he goes on this roughly 3-year process of building what we're sitting in right now, which is Hammond Castle. And he brings a lot of the parts of the organ from the bungalow over. The castle was completed in 1929. It was started roughly 3 years before that. Now, this era of the castle is a little bit of a dark spot in the archives. We don't have a lot on the organ. So we kind of need to make conclusions based on what came before and then what came after. What we do have are these two pictures, or this one picture that I zoomed in on, which is, we can see a 2-manual console of who knows what origin here in the bottom of the Great Hall. Now, I think there's a couple of things to be pointed out if I just jump back a slide. If you can see, as compared to this current room, there is no pipes up at the top of the gallery. There is no organ console down here, although you see it in the next photo. And it's not terribly clear from the perspective of this picture, but there's not a balcony right here either, which is right above everyone's head. So things clearly changed over time. So the dark spot in the archives, there's not much we can do with that. But it doesn't seem like much change in those 10 years. My personal thinking is that, as Peter talked about very nicely at the beginning of the presentation, he was doing so many different things. The organ was not his only focus. And it could be that he just got busy with other things. And what leads me to this conclusion is that in 1939, so this is now 10 years later, he writes a letter to his friend Lester Donahue. And Lester Donahue was a touring concert pianist in the early 20s. He was the one who demonstrated Hammond's piano invention that Hammond had worked on, among all kinds of other things. And he wrote and said, I've decided to reassemble my organ, to put it back together. I miss it, is what he says. So clearly there was some sort of a breakdown in things. Now, excuse me? World War II. Well, yeah. Although what I will say is that Hammond keeps working straight through the war, and the organ actually has a lot of changes throughout the years. So that's also interesting. But so he has this breakdown. And then what we get is the last couple of pictures of Charles Willett. So Willett died in 1939. So he would have died right at the end of when these pictures were taken, after having worked for Hammond for 20 years. This is Hammond and Willett here at the castle. They're upstairs in a group of the organ pipes. And then this is Willett in his apartment that he lived in the castle. So his apartment was at the top level of the tower that faces the ocean. So if you ever go outside and you see up at the top of the tower, there's a window, like a bay window. That's this window right here. It's not easy to get up to. I don't envy him in his old age getting up there. But he did it, and he lived there. And he had quite the eclectic collection by the looks of it. So he was the person who in 1939 started the process of putting the organ back together. But obviously he did not survive much longer than that. The letter where Hammond says that he missed the organ was July, and it didn't last much further than that. So the man that took over was a man named Tolbert Cheek, who had originally worked for a couple of organ companies, but then also the Aeolian Company, working on the actual mechanism of those player systems that we were talking about. So he was not necessarily the high tier of the organ builders. He was still kind of operating by himself, but he was certainly not stupid. And he was the person that took over the project after Willett's death as a member of Hammond's staff. Now, in 1939, and this document is from 1941, but we have similar ones. They just weren't in as good condition as this one. Hammond draws up the plan for his new organ. This is a lot more traditional. It's still odd, but it's a lot more traditional to what an organist would expect. And on other pages, you can see there's something called a swell division here, and a pedal division. And on some other pages of this document, he has notes where he says, move this part of the organ from the old great division to the new great division. And he's clearly kind of rearranging things. So you would think that would be good enough, right? Let's just get the organ playing again. He misses it. No, not good enough for Hammond. He is interested in more. The biggest change that happens at this time as part of the rebuilding is that the Great Hall changes. And some of this comes from the fact that Hammond's father's will cleared probate. So he had a lot of money to work with, which also could have added to that drive to restore the organ. Well, suddenly I have money for it, right? So I have these two pictures here, which are a comparison. You can see here on the left, there is no organ balcony. And here on the right, there is one. Still nothing up here in the gallery by the rose window. This balcony was built custom. There was space for it. They just basically hadn't opened it up. And the screen that was put here, that you can see here today, is part of the organ case of the organ at the Marienkirche. I can never pronounce the German. I apologize. In Germany, which is a famous church where the organist Buxtehude played, and that Bach famously went to visit Buxtehude. So these organ screens were removed at some point and came into Hammond's possession. And then that church actually burned down in World War II. So I don't know if there are any other pieces floating around, but that is, if not the only, but one of the last remaining pieces of that post-World War II. So that's kind of cool. He wanted more. He wanted more organ. So instead of just moving the parts that he brought over from the bungalow, which he installed in the castle, actually, if everyone takes just a look around, if you see here up on the left of the rose window, the ceiling looks normal. But in actuality, you could see kind of a slight color difference between the panels of the ceiling on the left and the right. The ones on the right are a little bit more yellow, and the ones on the left, in the first kind of 3 bays there, right above the facades. That's because all of the organ lived up there in the ceiling. The height of building goes much further up that way. And what he did was, when he moved here originally, everything was up there. And then when he got this idea of expansion and said, let's use other parts of building. So that's when he looked over to this this right side of the building, the ocean side of the building. And where that facade is now, there was an art gallery in the room behind it. And he said, "No more, I'm putting organ in there." And instead of having one of his people build him a mechanism and do all that kind of thing, you think this is years later now. He's very busy with all of his different, naval and all of his other invention interests. Instead of having his team spend time building the organ for him, he goes out and buys one, or at least a large part of one. And that organ is the Welty Company Opus 253 from 1927 from St. Andrew Methodist Church in Manhattan. I don't know how well we can all do math here, but 1927 to 1939 is not a very long time for the church to have kept the organ, but I guess they didn't want it anymore. This organ is notable because it was designed by T. Tertius Noble. Remember that that organist that I mentioned earlier. T. Tertius Noble had a summer home in Rockport, and he was very good friends with Hammond, even necessarily before this time. So it's unclear. We don't actually have the records of the purchase records of the organ. We know it came here, and we know that T. Tertius Noble had helped design it. So it's probable to say that perhaps he was involved in its acquisition here. The other instrument that he got was, I don't have a slide of it because I don't have a picture of it, was parts of a home organ from New Jersey. That doesn't come in for another couple of years. I just thought I'd mention it here to kind of talk about him buying things, but I'll come back to that later. In addition to this instrument from St. Andrews, Hammond has his first encounter with G. Donald Harrison. Now this is 1941, so I'll give a little bit of a history on the next slide. But what happens is that in this letter in February of 1941, G. Donald writes to Hammond and says, "We met at a party. You invited me up to the castle. I said I would love to come. I dropped by. Hammond was away, but Hammond's organ man, Tolbert Cheek, showed him around the instrument, but they were still in the process of putting it back together, so he wasn't able to hear the organ. But what he says is, if you need any help, if you need anything, let me know." So then Hammond replies, and, the great thing with letters back in the old days, we have G. Donald Harris's letter of February 13th and then Hammond's letter of March 3rd. This was not instant communication via email, but so he wrote back, and he said, the pleasure of having you. That's great. Thank you for your offer. However, I would love to have you help, but keep in mind that this is not a Skinner organ. Ernest Skinner helped me with this organ, but this is not a Skinner organ. And the reason why this is important and interesting is that G. Donald Harrison, who was an organ builder originally from England, he was brought over by the Skinner Company in 1927 because the leadership of the Skinner Company thought that there needed to be some new blood in there. There needed to be some new ideas. This did not work out very well. Ernest Skinner and G. Donald Harrison had very different ideas about what an organ should be. Ernest Skinner wanted an organ that sounded like an orchestra and that was very smooth and was blown on high pressures of air, relatively high. And G. Donald Harrison had this focus on what came to be called the American classic design, which was a focus on less the sounds of the organ and more the music that would be played on the organ. So Skinner was concerned, do we have the sound of a flute here? Whereas G. Donald was concerned, this specific music of today, what organ can best show that in its best light? So, like I said, communications broke down. eventually E.M. Skinner was ousted from his own company in 1933. So now we're in 1939 here at the castle, 1941 that time, and they're now operating separately. But yet Hammond has them both in the same building, which is a fairly unique experience. I honestly don't know of many other occasions where that happened with these two. So it's kind of curious, but that's just how Hammond worked. He befriended people. He talked to people. He was just a collector of people. So he has to tell G. Donald Harrison, this is not a Skinner organ. Don't be turned off by that. But G. Donald Harrison doesn't really seem to care. He sells. Because, why worry about drudges when you can make more money? So he convinces Hammond, probably it wasn't hard to do, but he designs, this addition, to the organ, which was this collection of, 3 mixtures stops, which are, the certain type of organ stop, which are a large number of pipes that all play together, and you get kind of a tinkling, ringling sound. He gives 3 mixtures, and it's not listed here, but he gives an 8-foot stopped capped metal flute, which is called metal Borden. And he says, Joseph Bonnet, see, we're getting closer. He says Joseph Bonnet will want a metal flute like this. Who knows? But anyway, he sells these to the castle, and they are installed. So what happens is, when everything was moved in 1939, when he acquired the St. Andrew's organ, and put that alongside some of the other components from the organ here in the right side of the building, there were some of those older E.M. Skinner parts, still in there, in addition to the St. Andrews. So what G. Donald Harrison does is he replaces some of those, which were mixture pipes designed by Skinner, which would have had a very different sound. Or Skinner's mixtures would have been very different from G. Donald Harrison's mixtures. And he replaces them with these mixtures, and he fills an empty slot. I can't believe there was an empty slot, but he fills an empty slot with that metal board. This brings us back to Joseph Bonnet. And on July 10th of 1941, which is where we started, he recorded this. He recorded the organ. And I will skip the recordings now because I see the time that we're looking at. I don't want to keep you for too long. I'll play you a little bit, but he played a whole album, which was recently digitized thanks to grant money and thanks to the work on side of the archivists. So I'll just play a snippet of this. We have an entire album that we're going to work on re-releasing. So. So I'll just give you that little snippet, but that exists. Thanks, Joseph Bonnet. Does not go over well with Skinner. Skinner writes in August and says, "Please, on no account, dispose of the mixture pipes you replaced with the Harrison pipes. I want you to hang on to them until I see you, if you are so kind." Does not go over well. So you see this dynamic. It's in these days that Ernest, who has been advising on the organ, starts taking a step back on the kind of advising that he was doing back in the Bungalow, and now is just more of a friend to Ernest, to Hammond. However, at the same time, we go 2 years later, 1942 and 1944. 1942, Ernest Skinner supplies a whole lot of pipes. And this was basically, like I said, Skinner was interested in those solo stops and things. This was basically Hammond saying to Skinner, "I want one of everything." and he was happy to apply. So there's flutes, there's strings, there's bassoon, tuba, French horn, English horn, orchestral oboe, heckelphone, which was kind of a curious thing. Clarinet, cor anglais is kind of like a different type of clarinet, and chimes and a celesta, which is kind of like the sound from Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker. Thank you. That was 1944. G. Donald Harrison. Finally, after having poked Hammond and say, "You need more. That balcony area up by the window would be great for organ." He finally gives in, and he purchases what is actually described as a mixture. Again, a mixture being a set of pipes, but in organist terms, we call this a décomposé mixture because each of the stops is independent. But Hammond couldn't do anything simply. He ordered this mixture from G. Donald Harrison, put every single part, every stop, in its own little box that could be opened and closed. And then when I talk about adding knobs and things to the console, you would have a knob at the console for each one of these 6 so that you could choose which of them was louder at any given time. What's the musical point to this? No one knows, but he was trying things because he wanted to. So now he's added all this stuff, and now it's June of 1944, and he says, well, I had that little free manual console that Joseph Bonnet was playing, which you can see here. It was located up in this balcony here. And he said, I can't manage everything from here. So he writes to Frederick Austin, who was the president of the Austin Organ Company up in Hartford, a company which is still around today, albeit in a different form, slightly different form. And in June of 1944, he says, I've been constructing a large instrument for the last 15 or 20 years. It's more of a generalization, but he wants to add he wants to enlarge the console that he has, and he's outgrown what he had. So would you do it? And of course, Frederick Austin, despite the fact that it's 1944, says sure, and designs one of the largest consoles that Austin had ever designed up till that point. I don't know how many others this large, like you think there's 130 something different sounds on the organ, and then all kinds of different keyboards and buttons and things. So they draw a design in August of 1944, and by 1945 they had it. 4 manuals, all the switches and knobs and everything that you could ever want. What you can't see in this picture is that behind the music rack on top of the console was a player system like he had at the Bungalow, but it was its kind of self-enclosed thing. And down here on the right were the controls for it. That kind of looks like a piano. So that's the timeline. This is what I call the prime years of the organ. He decides to rebuild the organ. He has all that kind of stuff. And then up to 41 so that Joseph Bonnet can record. And then 42 through 45, he adds a couple more sections and enlarges console. And that's it for a whole many years. I think at that point he was just done. He didn't need any more. He got busy. That was good. So he switched his focus to the performers and the performances to have on the organ. Now I'm going to, again, kind of jump through this a little bit quickly. But yeah, so the organ at that point was first maintained by Tolbert Cheek and by Hammond's staff. And then as the years go on up until Hammond's death, which was in 1965, the last couple of years, there was an organ technician named Roy Carlson who had taken over the maintenance of the organ. And he was an interesting character. and but also a friend of Hammond's. So that was how things went. But really, no changes were made. There was just this focus on performers. So we had Marcel Dupré came and performed at the castle at least 3 times: 1946, 1947, and 1948. And Richard Elsasser, who was a young prodigy on the organ, and then later a very kind of well-known touring organist until his death, and at which time he just kind of disappeared off the face of the earth. Everyone forgot very quickly. And these were 2 organists that were very active here. Richard Elsasser especially was here almost constantly. He recorded over 20 albums of music on this organ. I'm going to play a snippet of what I feel is the best recording of this organ that we have. This is a little later in its life than we're talking about right now. This is closer to like 1950, 1960. But I'll play this. This is, if anyone knows the song The Bells of St. Mary's. Those are the literal bells. We're working on making all of these available soon in the future, I hope, so that you can listen to the whole things. My favorite recording of this instrument. So we've talked about Dupré. We've talked about Richard Elsasser. I could name literally hundreds, and I'm not even joking, hundreds of organists. At one point, they had a guest book here where they just made organists sign. That was more for visitors, just people that had stopped by. But you know, the list of performers goes on and on. It's a crazy list. But the one that everyone remembers, and I wonder if anyone can guess who I'm talking about here, is Virgil Fox. So Virgil Fox had 2 eras in the castle. The first was 1946 to about 1956. This was his younger years. And then the later was kind of the infamous Virgil Fox at Hammond Castle. So he recorded 2 albums here at the castle, the first in 1946 and the second in 1953. And these are very well-known albums. Lots of organists have these. Lots of organists who love them and listen to them all the time. My biggest sticking point, they are some of the worst available quality recordings of this organ that I have found. They're just the only ones that anyone has or knows about, despite Richard Elsasser's 20 to 30 albums. We're working on that. We're working on making more recordings available. They're still valuable, but they don't show off this organ in a good light. And I think a lot of historically where people have said, oh, I heard Virgil Fox's recording, and like, it was fine, but it wasn't great. It was not a good recording. So then the other era of Virgil Fox, then this is Virgil Fox at Hammond Castle, which was 1974 to 1976. What happened was in 1965, John Hays Hammond died. And in his will, he left the shares. So the castle was set up as a non-profit, as a trustee group during Hammond's time. Some people say for tax reasons, other people say it was not necessarily, but he operated as a museum that just kind of happened to have his home and his laboratory on it. You could still come in and walk around the grounds and maybe catch a sight of Hammond or whatever. When he died, he left the shares in the organization to his friend, Richard Cardinal Cushing of the Boston Archdiocese. Cardinal Cushing was more than happy to take it. He didn't mind. But then when the next cardinal came along, Cardinal Medeiros, this place is taking too much money. It's costing too much. It's handling us too much. So what they said is, we're going to put up those shares for sale. There were two groups of people that were interested. There was one, which was a group of Gloucester residents, who wanted to kind of, in their words, keep it as it is and keep it in Gloucester hands and all that kind of thing. And then there was this so-called New Jersey faction, which was led by Virgil Fox. And Virgil Fox, the famous concert organist, what he said he wanted to do was come in and turn this place into a music academy. He wanted to have more concerts. He wanted to have classes. That's all fine and dandy. The other thing that he said he wanted to do was take a giant, roughly 150 stop organ from that had formerly been at Harvard and install it here. Not quite sure where that would have gone, which I think was one of the questions. But these factions didn't like him. The Gloucester people wanted to keep the castle in Gloucester hands, and they didn't like his flamboyancy. He styled himself as the Liberace of the pipe organ. So think of everything that comes along with that. It didn't go well. And the long and short of it is, the drama, if anyone has, heard of all the drama surrounding it, I think the drama is a lot more complicated than it has to be. Essentially, Virgil Fox, I think, actually had good intentions for the building. I think he just was a terrible business manager and realized that the money wasn't there for it as the archdiocese had. And he also didn't get along with the group. So what he had done was he had raised money from friends and family and things to buy the shares in the castle. So this trusteeship was set up. He was just a member of that board. He didn't actually own the castle himself. He doesn't get along with the people on the board. He doesn't get along with the people in the community. So basically, he says he left. They say they kicked him out. He's gone. But that board, now with actually only two of the original five people who were on the board, keep it going. So the path, the trustee path, can be traced back to this event today. It's just that Virgil Fox was on it for a bit and then he wasn't. The other big thing that happened in Virgil Fox's time was the organ console that was up at the top balcony there was moved downstairs. And you might be saying, well, that doesn't look like what was upstairs or the Austin thing. It actually is. What they did was this black, like the area around the keyboards and the stops that's black colored, this is all original. The way that Austin builds their consoles is a steel frame that everything is bolted to. And what they did was they took the wooden side panels of the original console, replaced them, and put them with this light colored wood so that you could see the performer better. And they moved the console down to the floor, and it was on a rolling platform, so it could either be over there or it could be here, which, as you see in the photo, we're all looking in the same direction at this point. And that was basically it. No other changes happened to the organ. Virgil left. The organ came under the care of the Morel Organ Company, and they maintained it up until the late 70s, very early 80s, which is when John/Kim Bolton came, and he was a member of the board, but also the inheritor of the remains of the Aeolian Skinner Company and the E.M. Skinner name. So he had worked for one of the last remaining employees for Aeolian Skinner when they had shut down in the 50s, and then kind of inherited things through other businesses. He was on the board here. And what happened was this building has never been very helpful to the organ. It has, I believe, and one of the archivists can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the building was completed in 1939 and the first recorded complaint of water ingress was before then. So this is something that has been happening. The pipes that were up at the top balcony, those stopped playing in like 1975, 74, something like that. Maybe even before Virgil Fox's time. It's just the organ was never built in such a way to be easily maintainable, and it was never maintained well, because in Hammond's time, when he was focused on the organ, he was focused on the organ, but he didn't care about, the tuning and stuff of it. He was focused on the inventions and everything surrounding it. And when he didn't care about the organ, scatterbrain, he just didn't care. So he just kind of left it up to just happen. And that was what you saw continued up through 1984, 1985. Now, Peter can talk to that.
So as John said, Kim Bolton and the Skinner Company were involved at that point. The Austin console had in it something called the mechanical capture combination men reaction system. It looks like the inside of a cash register, but on steroids. All kinds of bell cranks and levers and pivots and all of the stuff. Finicky by reputation, and we had people like Hector Oliveira out of South America. We had Nicholas Kinniston from Westminster Abbey. We had a lot of organists coming here to play. Doug Rafter out of Portland, Maine. Ken Wilson. And it got to the point where they refused to come here anymore. Why? Because let's just say they're trying to set the mood and they're stopping their way down. Fewer and fewer stops, quieter and quieter, shades being closed a little bit. And he hit one more piston to go to the very last setting that they preset. And a whole bunch of reeds in the solar division they wouldn't come anymore. And so at board level, we got together with Kim, and we basically said Hammond, if he was alive, would be very much aware of solid-state equipment and would have been thinking for years about how could he take this evolving technology that's used in control systems and build it into the organ. So we chose at that time to build a new console, which was built around solid-state equipment rather than mechanical equipment. And that was finally put online about 1985. And as John said, the building was leaking a lot. We even have a photograph, John, was it Hammond and Willett?
Yeah.
In the Great Division, which is up there behind those two facades, in what used to be, what kind of room was it? Smart. Yeah, an art gallery. Suffered a great deal of water leakage. And we saw a picture of a gutter that had been installed against the oceanside wall, which was collecting water that was coming down out of the roof. And this is a picture with Hammond and Willett in 1941. And that gutter we took down 2 years ago as we began the process of dealing with water problems in the Great Division. So as John said, even though Hammond was a wonderful inventor and very curious to see what he could do about modifying the organ and coming out with new features and all, in practical terms, he had a building that was only 13 years old. 29 was the finish year from this building. In 41, he had leaks coming through the stonework. So the organ paid the price. We finally had to shut it down in 2000. So since that time, when you come on May 1st at 6 p.m., you will hear about the restoration process of what's been going on and what will be going on as we try to get this absolutely wonderful instrument back online again.
Mm-hmm. So, thank you, Peter. I think that was great. That great sharing. The only thing that I'll add to that is in those years post 1985, wish I should stand up again. There was really nothing that happened with the organ. Organ builders and technicians came and went. I know we have someone from Fisk here. There's a great letter to Fisk where they say, thank you for running over here very quickly to tune this before the concert. And, it was just a revolving door of people, and the organ just kept going downhill. And that never got resolved until they just stopped using the organ. So we're hoping to remedy that. We've started work. We have a plan, that plan and ideas and sharing, is going to be on May 1st. If you can forgive me 5 minutes more of your time, I've put together a video, that has some pictures of the instrument, and also it's set to a very nice, piece of music, played by, Doug Marshall, who is a student of Virgil Fox and who played here many times. And I feel like that should give you a very good overview of everything.
got a question?
Up there into the microphone. I was wondering if either of you had heard of the Bradford Organ Company out of Chicago?
Nicholas Bradford.
Walter Bradford.
Walter Bradford. I don't know if I the name sounds vaguely familiar, but
It might have been before you found it out playing Bungalow.
oh,
And I know he would come through here in the late 80s, early 90s with a partner. And I never knew why he was in Gloucester other than to see his sister, my mother.
Oh, well, I think he was one of the cycling tinkerers.
that would make sense. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Yes.
First of all, thank you for an outstanding presentation. You're very well suited in your role as an educator. And I have two brief questions. In the Skinner order from 1942,
Yes.
was that for pipes?
That was for pipes.
Okay.
Yes. So that was for an entire room's one section of the organ.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know the Cape Ann Museum is going to be having an exhibit on the pipe organ, and I'm wondering if Hammond Castle is collaborating with that.
We will have to see.
See it. There's some room.
Yeah.
There will be.
Okay.
Is where the stories of them digitized somewhere that are on the digital communal for people who like to hear the Bowery process?
Yes.
Because you're delighted that to buy the.
Yes.
He's wonderful. We have a whole bunch of recordings that we got that were on. Then I can't listen to a murder piece of music and tell you a deal buzz, but he could, and so he did. And there's over 14 that are ready in Utah.
So of the recordings that have been digitized, there are a couple of albums from famous organists. So we have the Marcel Dupré concert that he gave here in 1947. That entire concert was recorded. And that includes a recording of him. The last piece he played on that was an improvisation, which is a French style, an improvisation on a theme submitted by T. Tertius Noble. So both Noble and Ernest Skinner and such were in the room for that concert where that was recorded. So we have that. He's playing half of his own music and half of Bach. So it's very interesting to hear a French organist play Bach. We have a concert by Leo Sowerby that's recorded. We have a concert. He was another kind of famous cathedral, big Anglican church organist. We have the Joseph Bonnet concert. Well, actually, that was recorded as an actual album. So we have that. A number of things by Richfeld Sasser. And then what Beth was talking about was we have all a variation of kind of miscellaneous and previously unlabeled recordings. So we've been going through, the recordings are up on what's called the Digital Commonwealth, which is a website, kind of a library type website where you can go up and see. The thing with those recordings is that they are the unedited recordings. Say for the Dupré concert, it's the unedited recordings of that concert. The other interesting thing to note is that back in 1947, they did not have the proper technology to record for long enough to record an entire organ piece. So the pieces are split up onto multiple sides of a record or even multiple records. The unfortunate thing with that, because they had to manually switch records, there are a couple of seconds of every piece that's like that they're missing. But what we're doing, what I've already done with the Dupré recordings that we're working on the other ones, is gone through and actually edited them down so that you can listen to them as an album. And we're working on getting those out when we can. So, come.
With the Boston Blackberries website.
Yeah. So you can go and hear the unedited. They're just not as friendly to listening right now, but they're can go here. Anyone else?
So we're big fans of the C Fisk Company. You've gone to a few houses. Are they helping you at all with this? Are they involved in all with this?
No, not at this point. What I will say is that we are collaborating with a number of different organ industry companies. But full details of what we're doing moving forward and whatever we'll talk about on May 1st. So
we got one thing I'd like to say about Fisk, and they're just a few miles from here in Magnolia. When I got out of the service, I was waiting to get back into Northeastern. I'd worked for an organ company. When we moved here, I knew of C.V. Fisk, and I went and met with Charlie Fisk with the hope that I might fill the work there. And he was very honest and won from that. This guy was a physicist by training, by the way, and worked on the Manhattan Project and had some concerns about where that was going and all, and decided just to come back to Gloucester to build pipe organs, very good pipe organs. And he indicated that, with all due respect, he didn't want to hire anybody who had worked for another organ company because they, by definition, had bad habits.
See, that was my attempt to get booked out to see the best, but
they are a wonderful company. They make trapper organs, so all mechanical mechanisms of kind that go way back before we ever electrified.
Yeah. Yes.
Let's take 2 more questions.
How much was he spending on this organ compared to, say, what the average touring the upkeep will lie to risk at time? Can you repeat the question?
Yes. Do you mind just repeating it? How much is he spending on? How much is he spending on it?
Compared to church organs.
As compared to church organs?
Yeah, worlds of RV quantity.
It's hard to say because we don't actually have price sheets for it, because he was building this in a non-traditional way. He didn't write, like he written to Volker and gotten a price. He didn't do that ultimately. He was just having his staff build it for him. So it was really whatever hourly and materials that they had there. It's a large organ, so could be either way. But we don't have numbers on that, unfortunately.
But was it a lot compared to it? Or it shouldn't?
This is a very large organ, so compared to your village church, yes, just based on pure size, it would have been a lot more.
You didn't want to store a lot of organ anyway.
Well, except for the parts that he got. Like I said, there was the St. Andrew's organ from New York. There was part of an organ from someone's a residence organ in New Jersey. But then there's parts even in the St. Andrew's organ that Welty had gotten from other organs. So those are Hook and Hastings pipes. We have pipes from down the road. We have pipes from all over the place. Actually, my favorite tidbit, which I forget to tell, we have a set of pipes from the Methuen Memorial Music Hall that he bought from Skinner when Skinner was maintaining the hall. I don't foresee them asking for them, and I don't foresee us giving them back. But all joking aside, we're actually unclear as to what set of pipes those are. We just have a letter that says thank you for the pipes. There are so many old pipes in this organ that it's. Yes.
So you can see what a treasure these 2 are, Thomas.
And getting this out. Thank you for extending the time and spending time with us. Now, if everybody would take out their phone and go to May 1st at 6:00, a good hold, come on back and hear more. And tell your friends too. So it's a big project. It's in great hands. It's a fascinating journey. That's the first time I've heard all of this. And I want to thank you so much for coming and being here with us in February. We haven't been open in February or March. Come on back. We're doing a lot. And thank you for spending your time with us today. And thank you